In this lecture, we ask the questions, to what extent is a leadership approach or the choice of a particular type of leader contingent on a situation? If so, if situational dependency matters, what is the approach contingent upon? What aspects of a situation or context matter the most? Of course, this leads to a bigger question. Can leaders adapt their approach to different contexts? To what extent is leadership style flexible? Some people believe that leadership style is a very static thing. And in fact, they argue that people should worry most about being consistent in their leadership style, that they shouldn't try to flex to adapt to different situations. Others argue that flexibility is paramount, that people have to read the situation and read their people and modify their behaviors accordingly. Now let's take a look at a case study to start out, an example of a particularly interesting leadership approach. The company we're going to look at is Serengeti Eyewear, an entrepreneurial division within Corning. This case study, written by David Garvin, examined the turnaround at this division many years ago. Serengeti was a premium, technology-oriented sunglass company aimed at the high end of the market. Now, this was a business that was struggling badly, and Corning senior executives wanted to shut down the division. Zaki Mustafa was an entrepreneurial leader within Corning who argued against closure, and he successfully convinced executives to keep the division open. Moreover, he convinced them to let him try to turn it around, and he embarked on a remarkable transformation. He took a number of important steps early in his tenure to try to reshape Serengeti Eyewear. First, he rationalized the product line. When he took over the job as president of this unit, it had 230 different types of sunglasses that it marketed and sold. He reduced that product line to just 53 items. He reinvested to make Serengeti a technology leader once again, arguing that the best way to differentiate Serengeti was on certain high-quality attributes of the sunglasses, particularly technological innovations that would keep it ahead of the competition. He engaged in a great deal of guerrilla marketing, that is, not traditional advertising on television and radio, but other kinds of events to build word of mouth and grassroots support for the Serengeti products. So, he gave away his products to star athletes. For example, championship skiers were shown wearing the glasses during events that were televised, or they were seen in various public settings wearing the Serengeti eyeglasses. He gave them to state troopers who could use them while on duty, to ski instructors, to pilots for commercial airlines, as well as to military pilots. He set up booths on ski slopes throughout the country where tourists who were going there to ski could take the sunglasses out for a trial run, and hopefully that would encourage them to buy. Did Mustafa's efforts work? Well, indeed they did. The financial results were remarkable. David Garvin reports in his case study that sales increased 4 times in the first 2 years of Mustafa's leadership. Gross margin increased 6-fold. Looking down the line a few more years, he examined what had happened to sales and gross margin over a 5-year period. Sales had gone up by 3 times over that period, and gross margin also had tripled. By gross margin, we mean what is the profit after the costs of the components are taken into account. But we're not deducting all of the other expenses, such as the overhead expenses of running the corporation. Serengeti didn't just do well in terms of financial performance under Mustafa. It won many product awards, and it expanded globally, beginning to sell its sunglasses across continents throughout the world. Now, what type of leader was Zaki Mustafa? How did he achieve this remarkable transformation of this division, which was at the brink of closure by senior management at Corning? Well, he was a very relationship-oriented leader with a very informal style. He believed in getting to know each of his subordinates on a personal basis and then tailoring his leadership approach to their individual needs and desires and styles. He would walk around constantly throughout the organization, talking to people over coffee and over lunch, trying to understand his employees. And remember, this division was of a manageable size. It was rather small within Corning at that time. Corning, of course, was a very large corporation, but Mustafa wasn't running an entire corporation. He was running this small unit. He said, quote, "I regard myself not just as a business manager, but as a surrogate father for our employees. I say to our employees, you worry about your work, I'll worry about you. I am a friend, and I get a lot of pleasure out of it." Seems like a very odd approach to leadership, but it worked for Mustafa. He shared with them his own views around philosophies of Eastern religions and the like that would help people lead better lives. And at the same time, he wanted to know about them. He wanted to know about their childhood, and he tried to understand each person's individual motives and desires. What did they want out of life? What did they want for their careers? What were their aspirations and dreams? And where did they want to go within Corning and within Serengeti? Well, he was very successful at turning around the division. There's no question about it. But this story raises an important set of issues and challenges for us as we think about leadership. Key question is Mustafa's approach scalable? What do I mean by that? Well, remember I said this was a rather small division in size, scale, and scope. Could this approach work if Serengeti continued to grow? What happens if it's a $10 billion or $15 billion company? Or we could ask, is this appropriate, this leadership approach, in other contexts? Would it work in an entirely different kind of organization or an entirely different culture? Mustafa was very successful, but when I teach this case to my students, they often say that this was very idiosyncratic, that Mustafa's approach worked well in this particular culture with these particular employees, but they find it hard to believe that he could transfer it to a different context and succeed. They often talk about how he's a classic entrepreneur. Remember, we often hear about people who found companies and grow them. And they're very successful in the early going, when they're taking an idea and bringing it to market and pleasing customers. But then when the organization begins to grow and scale and scope, often they have a hard time transitioning. Their leadership approach worked very well with a small team of people they could get to know on a one-to-one basis, much like Mustafa did. But it doesn't work so well when you can no longer personally interact with all of your employees and followers. And therefore, we often see entrepreneurs, founders of organizations, moved out, pushed aside, and professional managers brought in who have a very different approach that is deemed more appropriate for the organization's scale and scope. So many of my students look at Mustafa and see him much like a founder who gets pushed out over time. They say, this approach works, this leadership style is effective, but they don't think it would work at a broader scale. And they question even whether it would work in other kinds of organizations and cultures. Now, this lecture then will examine the situational perspective on leadership in much greater detail. Is the effectiveness of a particular leadership approach context dependent? And there are really two streams of literature in this regard. One stream is looking at the extent to which leadership approaches are the same across different contexts. And the other goes deeper to understand the situational factors that seem to moderate the relationship between certain leader attributes and behaviors and effectiveness. So we will look at a number of theories and models in this lecture that examine why leadership effectiveness depends on the situation. And these models are often referred to as contingency models. And they represented a great leap forward from the early traits models that we talked about in the prior lecture. At this point, I'd like to remind you of some famous words of Milton Friedman that I learned from one of my mentors when I began as a teacher. My first academic teaching job was as a graduate student in the economics department at Harvard. And my mentor was Martin Feldstein, a very famous economist who has published a number of key works in the matter of public policy, particularly looking at things like deficits and taxes. He also served as Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor during the early 1980s. Feldstein, for many years, led the teaching of the introductory economics course at Harvard, which 1,000 students per year took. He would hire a number of graduate students to help him teach the course, and he would teach us about teaching. And I can remember those boot camps so well. And he said something very important, drawing on the words of Friedman. He said, look, we are going to teach a lot of models in this class. We have to remember that models are simplified representations of reality. In that sense, they're clearly wrong. They are not exactly the way the, quote, real world works. But that's not the critical issue. Teaching this course, teaching economics, is not about whether a model is right. The key question when we examine a model is whether it's useful. Does it help us understand human behavior? Does it help us make sense of our complex world and predict what might happen in the future? So this notion of thinking about models not in terms of right or wrong, but instead about their usefulness is something I want you to keep in mind, because we're going to look at a number of models now of leadership, of contingency, that are clearly wrong in a fundamental sense. On the other hand, they may be very useful for us in helping us understand more about this phenomenon we call leadership. Now let's start with Fiedler. Fiedler offered one of the first, most powerful contingency models of leadership. He called this the least preferred coworker model, often referred to as the LPC model of leadership. He developed something called an LPC score. Now, what was this? Well, he surveyed many, many leaders, and he asked them to think about their coworkers, past and present. And he asked them to identify the person with whom the leader worked or had worked, who they had worked with least effectively. It's a rather interesting thing, right? Think about a person you struggled working with. And then they asked the leaders to rate that person on a set of bipolar adjective scales. This was really meant to get at the motives of the leader by asking them to think about others with whom they'd struggled to work. Well, what does this least preferred coworker score then mean? Well, a high score meant that close interpersonal relationships mattered to the leader, and that they tended to employ a supportive leadership approach, according to Fiedler. A low score tended to mean that the leader was motivated primarily by the achievement of tasks, rather than their relationships with subordinates. So this dichotomy emerged between task-oriented leaders and relationship-oriented leaders. Some people just want to get the work done. Others care much more about how their followers and subordinates are feeling, their emotions, their interpersonal development, and the like. Now, three aspects of the situation were deemed to matter by Fiedler. In other words, how did you decide whether to employ this task-related focus or relationship focus? Or how do we know whether a task-oriented leader will be more effective than a relationship-oriented one? We said, on the one hand, it depends on the extent to which subordinates are loyal. Are they friendly and cooperative by nature? Second, we have to look at the position power of the leader. How much authority do they have in the organization? And lastly, he said, we have to look at the structure of the task. Are there standard operating procedures in place? Is this a very structured, clearly defined task, or is it highly ambiguous in nature? So then he tried to ask, when does a low LPC score work well? When do we need a high LPC score? When do we need a task-oriented leader versus a relationship-oriented one? Well, he argued that if it's a very structured task, and if the leader has strong position power, a great deal of authority, and he naturally has subordinates who tend to be loyal, then a low LPC score, a task-oriented leader, works quite well. On the other hand, if it's a very ill-defined task, lots of ambiguity, and if the leader has weak position power, Fiedler then argued that you need a high LPC score. You needed to be relationship-oriented to really get to know your subordinates and build ties with them to get them to do what you wanted them to do. Well, that was an interesting set of studies, but of course, a number of people raised issues with his approach. There were empirical weaknesses identified by many scholars, methodological concerns with the studies used by Fiedler and others to try to support his predictions. In particular, they noted that these were mostly correlational studies, and many of them actually had weak results. Weak, I mean statistically insignificant or weakly significant results. But perhaps more importantly, scholars pointed out conceptual weaknesses with the Fiedler model. Shrisheem and Kerr said, this is a measure in search of meaning. In other words, what's the theory here that suggests that LPC score matters? It's a nice survey, but it doesn't seem to relate to some underlying body of psychological thought that helps us predict human behavior and leadership effectiveness. Others asked, are these LPC scores stable over time? In other words, is a leader always task-oriented, or relationship-oriented, or do they change over time and across situations? And lastly, how exactly does this LPC score affect group performance? What are the intervening processes that go from the leader's approach to outcome? Do we understand them? So, there's no question that this theory has much less impact today. People have criticized it roundly. Yet I would argue Fiedler made a major contribution to our understanding of leadership by drawing early attention to situational factors and launching a very rich stream of work on contingency models of leadership. So let's turn now to examine some of the other models. Before we do that, I would point out that many of these models, as you'll note, focus on this idea of how you are working with your subordinates and how well you motivate them or get them to do what you want them to do. And of course, there's a lot of focus on this practically on the part of organizations as they examine their cultures and evaluate the leaders in their organizations. Lots of people talk today about employee engagement. What does that mean? Well, they're trying to measure the extent to which employees are self-motivated. They feel like it's an environment that's supportive and that makes them feel like they want to go to work and that they want to get their job done, and it's not just about getting a paycheck. How actively are they engaged in their work and in their organization? Glenn Rowe and other scholars have said that this focus on engagement essentially is arguing that relationship-oriented leaders must be more desirable. Well, Gallup has done a lot of work on this, and the Gallup Management Journal has provided some startling statistics based on studies of engagement in organizations. They've reported that only 29% of employees in their surveys deem themselves actively engaged in their jobs. 54% of employees are not engaged at all. And 17% of employees in their surveys seem to be actively disengaged in their work environment. Well, does engagement matter? All of this work that Gallup and others have been doing. I mean, many of my clients, as I go out and help organizations develop their leaders, I note that many clients use the Gallup surveys or other organizations' evaluative assessments that are used to measure employee engagement. Gallup and others who conduct these surveys argue that engagement drives performance. They're backing a relationship-oriented view of leadership. And many companies administer these surveys, but I would ask you this question: what's the direction of causation? Does engagement drive performance, or does a successful organization tend simply to then lead to engaged employees? Do people like succeeding? I think we have to step back and not worry so much about whether we believe this is endorsing relationship-oriented leadership in all settings or not, and ask, is this simply a useful device for driving changes in leadership behavior? In other words, it's not about the engagement scores per se, it's about how you use them to modify behavior. And there's no question that the effect of the direct supervisor is great, that employees do care about how they're treated, and they do change their motivation in a way based on this engagement issue. It's just not clear if it's really appropriate to say there's one best model to driving engagement in your organization. Now, in thinking about this LPC model and this notion of task versus relationship-oriented leaders, I think it's useful to give us an example that will help us understand the limitations of this kind of approach. So let's compare two famous basketball coaches for a moment, both of whom have had tremendous success. John Wooden, who led UCLA in the college basketball tournament to great success over many years, and Bobby Knight. Both of them presumably faced a fairly similar situational context from the perspective of the Fiedler model, yet they adopted very different leadership styles, but both were incredibly successful. Look at John Wooden for a moment. He won 10 national championships in college basketball and 7 in a row as the coach at UCLA. At one point, his team won 88 consecutive games. And overall, he won 620 games at UCLA while only losing 147. Well, that's a great success story, and we might look to the attributes and the approach and the leadership style of Wooden if we wanted to coach a basketball team. People described him as meticulous, as disciplined, as nice, as a great teacher and mentor, as approachable, as someone with strong values, who could build good relationships, even with people at times on his team who could push back a lot on his demands and his discipline. Many people have written about how well he was able to establish expectations and discipline with Bill Walton, who was a revolutionary, who liked to rebel at many times when he was at UCLA playing for Wooden in the early 1970s. Contrast that with Bobby Knight. 3 championships at Indiana University, a perfect season in which the team did not lose a single game, a record-setting 902 wins at Division I level when he retired. And think about the adjectives people use to describe Knight: a tyrant, volatile, overbearing, authoritarian, but also a mentor and a teacher. 2 very different leadership approaches, one much more task-oriented, the other more relationship-oriented, but both very successful in a very similar context. If there's a good example of why the LPC model is limited, we have one with the contrast between Knight and Wooden. Now, another contingency model that followed Fiedler was the path-goal model. Path-goal theory looks at leaders and says, how can their behavior affect subordinate satisfaction and effort? And then it looked at situational variables that might moderate the relationship between leadership behavior and those outcomes. The idea behind path-goal theory was very much that the leader's job was to remove obstacles and clear a path and guide people in some way toward achieving their goals and the organization's goals. And as a result of this work, scholars were able to identify 4 different leadership behavior types, 4 different ways that people could define and clear a path to achieving goals for their followers. Supportive leadership was one. It was about nurturing your followers and getting them to develop over time. Directive leadership, in contrast, was very much about guiding them, providing them a very clear path, telling them what to do. Participative leadership was a third type. This was about getting them involved, empowering them to participate in the development of the goals and of the strategies to achieve those goals. And lastly, there was what they called achievement-oriented leadership. The idea here was that the leader provided challenges. He really set ambitious targets for followers and then encouraged them to go above and beyond to achieve those goals. Well, what were the findings from this body of contingency theory? Well, there were mixed empirical results. Most studies found a positive effect of supportive leadership regardless of the situation, going against the very heart of the contingency argument. And most situational moderators of directive leadership were not found to be impactful at all in the empirical studies. There were also conceptual problems with much of this work. It was tough to use such broad categories of leadership behavior to examine results, to examine effectiveness. And if you considered only one variable at a time, then maybe you were missing interactions of various situational variables that might matter. So there are limitations, much like there were limitations with the LPC model, but again, we find an important contribution from this contingency approach to studying leadership. It certainly helped us understand key characteristics of a situation that leaders ought to attend to as they decide how to act. Moving forward, Hersey and Blanchard proposed a theory of situational leadership that gained a great deal of traction in the real world. That is to say, many organizational development folks working to help coach and mentor people in organizations seem to adopt this next contingency theory of leadership. The argument of these 2 scholars was that the level of follower maturity should determine how a leader should behave. Low follower maturity meant that leaders needed to focus on task a great deal. Moderate maturity meant that a high relationship orientation was required, but still a moderate task focus as well. And high follower maturity meant that leaders didn't need to worry about driving hard either on relationship or task, that they didn't need to give a lot of direction, that they need to empower and give freedom and autonomy to their followers. This, as I said, has gained a great deal of traction in the leadership development circles and programs that companies implement throughout the world. Perhaps it's because the theory focuses attention on the need for leadership flexibility and adaptiveness. In short, people like the message here, that you have to get to know your followers well, and that the same approach may not work well for all of your subordinates. And the idea here that you're sort of assessing how much your people are capable of on their own, and then determining how much direction to give them, seemed to be a very powerful idea, and it really caught hold in many companies and other organizations. But I would point out again that the empirical support for this actual model and its propositions is somewhat weak. The last of these contingency models that I want to focus on is narrower in scope, but has had more success in terms of predictive power of behavior. Vroom and Yetton are two scholars that focused more specifically on leaders' decision-making processes. They examined how situational variables could drive the appropriate decision-making approach. And they examined a range of different ways that leaders could go about making choices, ranging from a very autocratic approach, where they were driving the decision process hard, to a more consultative approach, as well as ones where they were jointly making decisions with their followers. And they asked a very simple question: under which conditions should you adopt each approach? When should you be more autocratic? When should you be more consultative? And actually, there was some solid support for their propositions in their studies, better than most contingency theories. The idea here is very important, this notion that, sometimes you can solve a problem yourself. Other times you have to get data from subordinates, but then simply make the choice yourself. Other times you want to share the problem with subordinates individually and garner their advice and then make a decision. And then you might go further in your consultative approach and share the problem with the group as a whole and garner their advice and then make a decision. And lastly, the most participative approach is to work collectively with your followers to generate ideas, discuss options, and try to reach consensus. What are the challenges with this normative decision theory that Vroom and Yetton put forth? Well, I would ask you, is decision-making an event or a process? Can we really look so discreetly at this point in time where a leader decides, do I want to be autocratic or participative? Can leaders really be as flexible as the Vroom and Yetton model suggests? Most leaders I know do adapt to some extent across situations, but can they really move from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other in the matter of days or weeks? And lastly, do these leaders actually always make a choice strictly on the content of the decision, or do we have to think about both process and content? David Nadler has written about this. He says, we can't think of people as being directive in one dimension. On the one hand, you can be directive about the content of a decision. But on the other hand, you might be very directive about the process a team uses to approach a decision. But you're giving them a lot of room to consult and provide advice and work collectively on the content of the choice. So Nadler says the spectrum is a little too simplistic that Vroom and Yetton have adopted. Overall, though, there's better support than most contingency models here. Perhaps it's because Vroom and Yetton focused on one specific aspect of leadership, decision-making, rather than trying to create this broad theory that stretched across a wide range of leadership behaviors and results. When we think about this idea of flexibility that Vroom and Yetton have sort of introduced to us, I think of a very interesting study that Tom Eisenman and Joe Bauer did at Harvard about the entertainment industry and its CEOs. They noticed something really interesting in the entertainment business. You have these all-powerful executives that ruled during the 90s and the early part of the 21st century in some of these companies. You had Rupert Murdoch, you had Sumner Redstone, you had Michael Eisner at News Corp, Viacom, and Disney, respectively. These were, larger-than-life figures. And yet they asked, are these very powerful CEOs always top-down and autocratic and authoritative, or do they adapt their approach over time? What they noted is that some of them did seem to flex their approach. They observed that firms in this industry might be benefiting from leaders who provide subordinates a fair amount of autonomy to run independent business units. But at the same time, they seem to periodically intervene in a more top-down way to achieve certain results. And they asked the question, why do they shift and flex toward a more autocratic approach at times, when most of the time they seem to provide a lot of autonomy and independence and freedom to their people? And they said, really, there are sort of a few instances when people seem to get more directive in this business. It's often when there are opportunities that don't reside neatly in one of the units of the corporation, but that require cooperation and synergistic effort on the part of people across different parts of the organization. And when there are new radical technologies that might really disrupt the business, where there's a need for people to get shaken up a little and for management to intervene on a top-down basis. And they argued that Murdoch and Redstone tended to do this very well, provide autonomy and then flex their approach to becoming more autocratic when necessary, when truly innovative opportunities arose. They contrasted that with Eisner, who was a pretty consistent micromanager, and maybe that got him in trouble eventually at Disney. So in conclusion, what have we learned here? In some ways, you might be discouraged by this short foray through some of the major theories of leadership. I mean, we don't seem to have found many answers. We've said that leadership is contingent on certain situational variables, but then we've had a hard time defining what they are and coming up with clear, testable propositions that have been backed by empirical evidence. On the other hand, we have to remember we're dealing with a very complex social phenomenon. It's simply hard to boil leadership down to a set of boxes and arrows and testable hypotheses, as scholars have tried to do. Really, more broadly, we have to face up to the fact that there's an equifinality problem here. In other words, there are many ways to achieve the same outcome, and many causes of a particular result. So it's very hard to define linear cause-effect relationships when it comes to leadership. On the other hand, we've also learned a lot and made progress in looking at these theories. We have a good understanding of why a trait approach is limited. We understand that context matters, and we've got a better understanding of the types of contextual variables that we should pay attention to. So in conclusion, we need to recognize that we either need different people for different kinds of tasks, or we need leaders to be flexible in their approach.